Our final speaker is Robert McKenzie. He's a senior fellow at New America and founding director of its Muslim Diaspora Initiative. He's a domestic and foreign policy analyst and scholar of the Middle East and North Africa with 15 years of applied research and work experience for the US government, private sector, and academia. An anthropologist by training, he was a visiting fellow and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where he focused on Muslim communities in the West and the Syrian refugee crisis. So, Bobby, you're up.
Great. Thank you, Asma, for having me, and I'm delighted to be up here on this panel. Because I'm an anthropologist by training, I prefer to hear more from you and be involved in a dialogue than I do to talk. But I just want to maybe provide just a little bit of a different angle as somebody who is traveling across the country and trying to meet with Muslim community leaders to hear from them what's going on the ground. But I guess I might like to start just by taking a minute to think a little bit about the way we're even framing this conversation and talking about Trump. And I don't think there's anything that I can add here to suggest that I don't think there's anything that I can add that hasn't already been said about how difficult this particular administration is. But perhaps I'm a little bit less equitable than Asma when thinking about sort of where we are. And I think things need to be contextualized. And it's worth remembering that it's not just Donald Trump. We had a campaign where you had folks running for the nomination on one side of the aisle, and it was an ugly race to the bottom with regard to a set of issues, Muslims being one of them. And when Chris Christie says, I wouldn't take in even a 5-year-old orphan who's Muslim, and people don't push back on that. And on the other side, we heard about talking about engaging Muslims, largely through a prism of we need to work with them to identify the problems. And when we talk about values, I think we need to be engaging every community, not to try and identify problems. I mean, maybe that's one aspect of it. And so I was troubled by this dialogue, this national dialogue we had, but I was equally troubled that we had a president who chose to visit a mosque just one time in the US in his 8 years. One time. And if you talk to political operatives and you say, why is that the case? We say, well, we didn't want to lose the House in 2010. Well, we lost the House in 2010. And then I heard, well, we had to recalibrate, and we had to be careful in 2014. Well, let me tell you, 2014 was one of the worst years for Democrats in 77 years, I believe. I know, because I ran for office that cycle. And so if we're not going to be out front with our values and our principles, what are we waiting for? I don't quite get it. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that we had a president who, up in Michigan, in my home state, had 2 veiled women removed from the stage. So I get Trump, I get what happened, but I think we need to recognize that this is within a wider context that should give us all concern. And thinking a little bit about this the last few days, this talk, I couldn't help but to sort of springboard back to 1995 when we had the Oklahoma City bombings. And in 1996, the response was a piece of legislation, 2 pieces of legislation. The first piece called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. And then a second piece of legislation which led to essentially what was known as the secret evidence legislation. This really was a set of popular legislation for the wider country and thinking about how do we respond to terrorism. Despite the fact that Timothy McVeigh, a Michigander, Christian Michigander, was the one who carried out the Oklahoma City bombings. And this led to essentially dozens of people being deported. And of these dozens of people, the focus was by and large on Arabs and Muslims. And this really fired up the community. If there was a silver lining in all of this, the community writ large mobilized politically, I think, in ways that they hadn't before. And in the 2000 elections, they went out and voted in large numbers for George Bush. I think it's something in the order of around 80%. And Muslims make up large numbers in Florida. And if anyone remembers the hanging Chad, I think Muslims, even then and certainly not now, are not voting at the levels that they can, but they do matter on the margins in key states. And Florida was one of those states. And of course, everything changed in 2004 for all the obvious reasons that people know. But the secret evidence courts came underneath a Democrat. And then we had the Obama years. And, well, before that even, we had the INS, and they enacted a rule, not a piece of legislation, called the National Security Entry-Exit Registration, identifying 24 countries. 90,000 people were impacted by this. 13,000 had deportation hearings. No one was prosecuted, for terrorism. Not a single person. And so I wanted to use this frame because when we think about where we're at right now, the strident, horrible language that this administration has used should give us all pause. But I think there is a silver lining. And I think the silver lining is what I'm seeing across the country. And I just told a story earlier to Will and Abby, who's here from the Washington Post, wherever she's sitting. And I was recently in Peoria, Illinois. And you might not know where that's at. It's in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. I apologize if you're from there. But as I drove from Chicago there, it's about a 2.5-hour drive. And I went there to give a public lecture. And I went there because I wanted to talk to the Muslim Student Association, because I was really curious to hear what life is like in the middle of farmland, where I presume that populism is on the rise. And it's a city of 100,000 people. The university, Bradley University, has only 5,000 students. So I thought, if there's a place where it's got to be bad to be a young Muslim, that's it. That's what I presumed going in. And so when I met with the Muslim Student Association, I said, what's it like here? He says, pretty good. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we don't have many problems. And I said, why not? And they said, well, for one, and I should offer one more point that's important. Caterpillar is headquartered there, so it's also a very blue-collar place. So not only is it not only a farming country, it's also a blue-collar city. So I thought these were the right ingredients. And what the students told me, to my surprise, is that their community, around 5,000 Muslims, which is 5 times larger than the national average, works hand in hand with the Christian community and the Jewish community and the mayor's office to confront and address, racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia. And I thought that was a really positive message. And in the last 40 days, since I've started my new initiative at New America, I've traveled to 5 cities, big and small, and there are certainly negatives. But I'm also hearing a lot of positives about community engagement. And I think this is really, really important. And so I guess if I had a message to impart on folks here to take away, is that this is a great time to seize sort of the situation on a very local level. But from my perspective, this is not just holding Donald Trump's feet to the fire. It is also holding Democrats' feet to the fire to ensure that when we get out of this mess that we're currently in, that we don't swing back to the old story of we need to engage Muslims because they can help us identify the bad apples. We got to get out of that narrative. And so I think that this is really a unique period with lots of negatives, but also I think lots and lots of positives. And so I'm going to end there, and I certainly welcome any views that people have. And as a general rule, I prefer only easy questions.
Don't we all?